from writer-director Rian Johnson.
The Holy Grail, a perfectly impossible crime.
Wake Up Dead Man has critics singing its praises.
God help me. Anything else?
It's a deliciously entertaining mystery.
That's nice.
It's certified fresh.
It's a miracle.
Okay, you're freaking me out now.
It's the best Knives Out movie yet.
This case is solvable, right?
Oh, you'll see. It's fun.
Wake Up Dead Man, a Knives Out mystery starring Daniel Craig. Now playing in select theaters on Netflix December 12th, rated PG-13.
The French Revolution set Europe ablaze. It was an age of enlightenment and progress, but also of tyranny and oppression. It was an age of glory and an age of tragedy. One man stood above it all. This was the Age of Napoleon. I'm Everett Rummage, host of the Age of Napoleon podcast. Join me as I examine the life and times of one of the most fascinating and enigmatic characters in modern history. Look for the Age of Napoleon wherever you find your podcasts.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 48 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. The War for Independence took place over 200 years ago. With that much distance, it makes it difficult for us to think about the realities of that violent event. Today, we are going to take a deeper look at an understudied area of the War for Independence, enemy prisoners of war. Ken Miller joins us to discuss his book, Dangerous Guests, Enemy Captives and Revolutionary Communities During the War for Independence. During our conversation, Ken reveals details about what American prisoner of war camps for British and German revolutionary POWs looked like, why the Continental Congress and Continental Army insisted on sending at least 3,000 POWs to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and the day-to-day experiences of both the British and German POWs in Lancaster and the civilian residents who lived among them. Are you ready to travel to the Pennsylvania hinterland during the War for American Independence? I hope so. Allow me to introduce you to my friend, Ken Miller.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Ken Miller is an associate professor of history at Washington College in Chestertown, Maryland. His research interests include colonial and revolutionary North America. Ken is the author of Dangerous Guests, Enemy Captives and Revolutionary Communities During the War for Independence, a book that explores how the American Revolution and the hosting of British and German POWs affected American identity formation among the diverse Anglo, Scots, and German residents of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Ken.
Happy to be here.
Ken, I'm just very excited that you have joined us because I don't know if you knew this, but you were the graduate student that I looked up to.
You need better role models.
You were great, Ken. You helped me get through grad school, so I am eternally grateful. So thank you so much.
Well, you're welcome. I'm glad to be of help.
Let's talk about your book, Dangerous Guests. But before we dive into it, why don't you start by telling us a bit about yourself, Ken, and how you became interested in early American history and how early Americans formed American identities?
Well, with regard to historians, I think our particular backgrounds often influence our specific interests and the topics that we choose to research and write about. And that's certainly true in my case. I came to the United States actually from Germany while still a child when my family moved to Pennsylvania. And so German was actually my first language. But upon arriving in the United States, I developed this early interest in American history. And I was curious about topics like the Revolutionary War, Civil War, westward expansion. And from Pennsylvania, my family soon relocated to Hawaii, of all places, and that's where I actually grew up, attending grade school and high school and ultimately university. And Hawaii, of course, is many things, but one of its most striking features is its remarkable diversity. You see a stunning diversity on display throughout the islands. And that made a really powerful impression on me from a very early age. And so when I began studying history formally in college, the topics in American history that most intrigued me often involved questions of identity and diversity. I was fascinated by how diverse Old World peoples became American, began identifying as American, and by how diverse groups interacted within their new communities. Did they get along? Did they not get along? And so when I began graduate school at UC Davis, these same concerns informed my dissertation, which ultimately, after considerable revision, became the book.
Ken's book, Dangerous Guests, examines the role British and German prisoners of war played in American identity formation in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, during the American War for Independence. Ken, what's so unique about Lancaster? Why did you situate your study in that community?
The book actually began as a general study of revolutionaries' management of their British and German captives. My preliminary research revealed that the Americans detained their prisoners in assorted detention centers in these host communities stretching from Massachusetts to Virginia. Now, additional research indicated that Lancaster was really the star of the show, quickly becoming the revolutionaries' chief detention site during the Revolutionary War. Now, for my purposes, it also helped immensely that Lancaster's wartime experience was just extraordinarily well documented. But what I found especially appealing was that Lancaster was also this remarkably diverse community, which, of course, squared with my particular interests. And ultimately, it just made sense to focus on Lancaster. So Lancaster was this community situated in the Pennsylvania hinterland, upwards of 60 miles west of Philadelphia, the provincial capital. Founded in 1730, it soon emerged as this thriving market town, home to not only merchants and shopkeepers, but also a large number of skilled craftsmen practicing a wide range of trades. Eventually, the community served as a sort of crossroads linking the eastern capital to Pennsylvania's western frontier. Like scores of neighboring communities dotting the Pennsylvania interior, Lancaster was settled largely by immigrants and their immediate descendants, and noted for its stunning ethnic and religious diversity. On the eve of the War for Independence, Lancaster was home to some 3,000 residents, over 60% of whom were German-speaking. Now, English speakers, both English and Scots-Irish, made up most of the remaining population. Now, adding to this ethnic diversity was a remarkable religious pluralism featuring Anglicans, Presbyterians, German Lutherans and Reformed, Moravians, and a small number of Quaker and Jewish residents. Now, in the surrounding countryside, you'd find members of the German sect, including Amish and Mennonites. So, for all intents and purposes, what you have in 1775 is an essentially divided community.
How did British and German POWs affect the formation of an American identity in Lancaster? You mentioned that it is a very diverse community, so I imagine you have pockets of Germans here, Scots there, English, in the middle. How did they all become Americans?
It's a really complicated business. Now, what you find in 18th century Lancaster is, as I said, this remarkably diverse community. Now, through the initial decades of settlement, that diversity occasionally fostered friction as English and German speakers approached their foreign neighbors with real suspicion and prejudice. You have a sort of clannishness at work, with English speakers preferring to associate with fellow English speakers and their German neighbors identifying and interacting with other Germans. Now, the vast majority of residents remained very parochial-minded, valuing what was close to home. For Lancaster, the dangers and dislocations of war altered that local dynamic as portions of the town's diverse residents found common ground in the shared enemies who threatened their community. Now, that was the case, for example, in the 1750s and 1760s during the 7 Years' War and Pontiac's Rebellion, when some of the community's distinct groups made common cause against their French or Indian enemies. Now, of course, the Revolutionary War proved even more transformative by forcing English and German speakers to not only mobilize and cooperate in new ways, but also on a significantly larger scale. Now, in Lancaster, the war disrupted these customary modes of interaction, of association, as English speakers suddenly found themselves squaring off against British redcoats, and German speakers squared off against Hessian mercenaries at the precise moment, mind you, when each began to appreciate what they shared in common with their foreign neighbors as fellow members of this community at war. As locals became increasingly alienated from the British Empire, militant patriots took pains to distinguish themselves from their wartime enemies, becoming in the process more self-aware, more self-conscious of their peculiar status as revolutionaries, as Americans. And so at moments over the course of the war, you'd see some of the more active supporters of the local resistance periodically transcending their narrower cultural and communal attachments and identifying more broadly with like-minded patriots, both within and beyond their particular community and province. Now, the arrival of literally thousands of enemy prisoners of war and the various challenges and opportunities associated with their presence ultimately intensified this process. Because of this ongoing proximity to their enemies, residents found themselves living a sort of daily war at home. So the war cast this continuing shadow over Lancaster that locals could never fully escape. Now, the prisoners, in other words, they produced this peculiar set of conditions in Lancaster, creating for the most committed supporters of the American resistance a sort of artificial hothouse environment that nurtured, that intensified their hopes, their fears, their passions, their resentments, rendering them at moments more expressive of their patriotism and of their broader attachments to the revolutionary cause. Now, because my book isn't an explicitly comparative study, it's difficult to say whether a similar process occurred in any of the Americans' associated detention centers. Now, that being said, sections of the book do explore conditions in some of these related sites, places like Reading, Pennsylvania, Frederick, Maryland, Winchester, Virginia, and I did actually find some interesting parallels in these communities. So there were, for example, clear demographic similarities among the prisoners and their hosts within these particular communities. And I'd find occasional hints of a similar dynamic in place and of a similar process underway. But what was probably most striking were the similar patterns in the treatment of prisoners across detention centers within these particular communities.
So Lancaster represents not just a great case study, but one that's representative of what's going on in other communities where they're hosting POWs.
Yeah, precisely.
Now, Ken just mentioned that thousands of POWs made their way to Lancaster. But how many POWs are we talking about? After Richard Montgomery's victories in Chambly and St. John's, Canada in 1775, the Continental Army shipped 700 POWs to Carlisle, Reading, and Lancaster, Pennsylvania, as well as other sites even further south. And this was just the first wave. Throughout the war, the revolutionaries would disperse up to 13,000 prisoners of war. Ken, why did the Army and Congress send over 3,000 POWs to Lancaster?
Yeah, I should probably say something about those numbers. Those are important. Now, the figure of 13,000 refers to the assorted captives detained in the vast hinterland region stretching from Pennsylvania to Virginia. Now, at points in the war, you could find additional prisoners held to the north in Connecticut and Massachusetts, and to the east of Lancaster and Philadelphia. All told, the revolutionaries held upwards of 15,000 prisoners during the War for Independence. Now, Lancaster would see 5,000 or so, but those were just the prisoners detained over an extended period. More would pass through Lancaster on their way to neighboring detention facilities to the south or to the west, or en route to their exchange for American prisoners held by the British. Now, the first large batch of British prisoners captured in late 1775 actually posed a serious problem for the Americans' new Continental Congress. Lacking a well-defined prisoner policy and the necessary accommodations for housing large numbers of enemy captives, the Americans had to improvise. And so there'd be a great deal of experimentation over the course of the hostilities. For Continental officials, the first order of business in 1775 was selecting a site where the captives could be conveniently lodged and safely secured. Lancaster, it turns out, fit the bill. Now, among other things, the community contained a large barracks from the 7 Years' War that could adequately house hundreds of prisoners. Continental officials also felt that Lancaster's residents could be relied on, having already demonstrated their enthusiasm for the American resistance by mobilizing men and supplies for the war effort. Additionally, the community was tucked safely away in the provincial hinterland, well removed from ongoing military operations and nestled in a bountiful agricultural region, which was an important consideration should the prisoners need to be supplied at American expense. So that was Congress's thinking at the onset of the war, but those considerations remained preeminent for the duration of the conflict. Now, by late 1776, Lancaster had an established track record for detaining large numbers of prisoners. So when the Americans suddenly found themselves in possession of some 900 Hessians, captured complements of the Battle of Trenton, Lancaster seemed the logical site for their detention. Now, within a few years, Lancaster residents had become seasoned in the hosting of both British and German captives. So for Continental officials, Lancaster often became the obvious choice for the housing of any additional prisoners, and there'd of course be thousands more to come before the war's end. And so that's how Lancaster became the Americans' principal host site for enemy prisoners and ultimately the centerpiece of this elaborate continental detention network spanning from New England to the South. I should note, too, though, with reference to those German prisoners, there was an added wrinkle. Now, in addition to the considerations that I mentioned earlier, the German prisoners were sent to Lancaster as part of a broader continental campaign designed to incite their desertion. Now, Continental officials' thinking was that if they detained their German prisoners, many of whom sprang from very humble origins in prosperous German-American communities like Lancaster, they'd eagerly defect from British ranks and join their American hosts. And so you'd see German captives not only in Lancaster, but also in other German-speaking communities like Reading, Pennsylvania, Frederick, Maryland, and Winchester, Virginia, before the fighting had ended.
It sounds like the Continental Army and Congress had to put a lot of thought into where they'd put their POWs, and Lancaster just seems to fit the bill because it's a safe place. It's in the hinterland, the population speaks a bit of German, and they're revolutionary, so they don't have to worry about the population being enticed with loyalist or British ideas. So that's not something we put a lot of thought into, but that's very interesting. Let's explore the experience of the POWs, their families, and the people of Lancaster and what that experience was like. Let's begin with the POWs. Ken, what was the POW experience like for British and German troops in Lancaster? What was their day-to-day life like, and did their experiences vary based on their nationality?
Yeah, those are good questions. Now, depending on the particular circumstances, prisoners' experiences could vary considerably based not only on their nationality, but also on their rank. Because of their superior rank and status, officers, both British and German, fared best of all. Officers were customarily placed on what they called parole, which afforded them more freedom than lower-ranking enlisted prisoners who, more often than not, were confined in some capacity. Now, paroled officers were permitted to rent rooms in private homes or in public inns or taverns. Now, typically, these paroles prohibited the officers from straying more than, say, 6 to 10 miles from their particular place of residence. Now, the conditions for the enlisted prisoners varied depending on whether they were confined in close quarters or hired out as laborers. Over the course of the war, Lancaster hosted mostly British captives who, because of their reputation for misbehavior, were generally confined to their stockaded barracks where they drew their provisions. Occasionally, they'd be joined in the barracks by some of their German comrades. Now, prisoners who proved especially troublesome could find themselves even more closely confined in the town jail. As you'd probably imagine, life in the barracks proved difficult for most prisoners. It was a tedious, mundane, and often deeply frustrating business, especially since many of the prisoners could expect to spend more than a year or more in captivity awaiting their eventual release from confinement. Now, apart from their access to the barracks yard, the captives confined within the stockade enjoyed little freedom. Depending on the number of prisoners in the barracks, conditions could prove quite cramped, with perhaps a dozen or more captives forced to share a single room. Now that, combined with miserable hygiene, was conducive to the spread of illness, and epidemics periodically cycled through the barracks. Now, within the stockade adjacent to the barracks, you'd actually find a graveyard for those who perished in captivity. Over time, of course, these conditions would contribute to a rise in escapes, particularly among the British prisoners who were more inclined than their German allies to attempt to flee for the safety of British lines. Now, if you were lucky, you got the option to hire out, which was the case for most of Lancaster's German prisoners, who quickly garnered a reputation for being better behaved than their British comrades. Over the course of the war, some of Lancaster's British prisoners also hired out, but generally in smaller proportions than their German counterparts. The hiring out of prisoners' labor was a familiar wartime practice, which actually predated the War for Independence. Part of the rationale for the practice of hiring out was this belief that the captives would prove easier to control if they were put to work and paid a wage, rather than, say, being confined in large numbers, which might prove more conducive to rebellion. Their captors, meanwhile, could actually profit from their labor. Now, the prisoners, for their part, found it appealing because they could avoid confinement and supplement their meager pay. So, theoretically, everybody wins here, right? Captives who hired out had to check in periodically with local authorities, but generally resided with their employers. Consequently, they enjoyed more freedom than those confined in their barracks. Locals who hired prisoners' labor first had to pay a bond to revolutionary officials as security for their employees' good behavior. If a prisoner escaped while in local employ, his employer was held responsible and forfeited the bond. Now, because of this local labor shortage stemming from residents' ongoing commitments to distant military service, Lancaster's prisoners often found their labor in great demand. The majority of prisoners who hired out worked on farms in the surrounding countryside, but a smaller portion of the captives actually claimed experience in the skilled trades and found themselves laboring alongside local craftsmen, with some of the Hessian prisoners in particular even fashioning shoes or cannon for the Continental Army. Collectively, these prisoners proved invaluable to the local wartime economy.
I imagine that the townspeople were happy in some ways to have them around, because the men that would normally perform those work that the prisoners are being hired for are gone. They're serving in the army, aren't they?
Right. Very often. Not all the artisans are enlisting in the militia or the Continental Service. Many of them remain local at home, but locals are always looking to supplement the local workforce.
In Dangerous Guests, Ken notes that sometimes the wives and children of captured soldiers followed their husbands and fathers into captivity. Ken, how did the people of Lancaster accommodate these family units? Did they imprison wives and children? Did they make the wives and children responsible for their own food and shelter? What was their experience like?
Yes, these were your so-called camp followers, right, who routinely accompanied these armies into camp. Now, actually, in writing the book, these were among the most difficult questions to answer, because the sources actually didn't provide much information about these women and children, who typically arrived in much smaller numbers than the prisoners themselves. Now, if they were mentioned at all, it was generally as an afterthought. So, for example, a resident might comment on the arrival or departure of a group of prisoners with, quote, their women and children in tow, end quote. Now, that said, one of the first problems that revolutionary officials faced in 1775 was housing provision for these prisoners' families. Wartime convention indicated that each of the major belligerents within a particular conflict was to provide for its own soldiers held in captivity by the enemy. So, theoretically, the British were to supply and provision their own troops in American hands, providing them with full rations. And I say theoretically because this didn't always pan out in practice. Now, my research indicated that the prisoners' wives and children were typically placed on half rations. Now, this and the fact that these provisions weren't always readily forthcoming because of the difficulties of supplying the captives prompted some prisoners to hire out in order to provide for their families. Now, in some cases, events could actually take an unfortunate turn. So later in the war, for example, when the Americans faced the cumbersome prospect of shouldering the continuing costs of providing for some of these women and children, specifically in this particular case, the families associated with the British Army captured at the Battle of Saratoga in late 1777, Continental officials basically cut off their supplies. Rather than receiving any more provisions at American expense, the families were given the options of either providing for themselves in captivity or returning to British lines. So, in effect, a prisoner's wife could work for her living in Pennsylvania or depart for New York in haste. Now, as far as lodging was concerned, in Lancaster, the women and children were generally housed in the barracks alongside the enlisted prisoners, but that too depended on particular circumstances. So again, later in the war, when Lancaster's barracks became too crowded, containing some 1,500 captives, the soldiers' wives and children were allowed to camp on the town common, but that was somewhat exceptional at the time.
Okay, what was it like for the civilians of Lancaster to host so many British and German POWs? Did they have an increased fear of the enemy, given that so many of their able-bodied men were away from home serving in the militia or the Continental Army?
That's a great question. For towns like Lancaster, the hosting of hundreds of enemy prisoners could prove a complicated enterprise, presenting both challenges and opportunities. Now, It's important to note that Lancaster was not only a detention site for captives, it was also a community that was mobilized for war. And so what that means is that a portion of the town's male inhabitants were periodically absent, performing distant military service with either the state militia or the Continental Army. You'd find some young men left at home, to be sure, but for the most part, you'd find the elderly, you'd find women, and you'd find children. What's more, that local militia had to be provided with whatever arms were available. In other words, at any given time, depending on whether the militia had been summoned for service, Lancaster could find itself alarmingly short of both men and munitions. And that's, of course, a problem when you find yourself in a community containing anywhere from 400 to 800 to as many as 1,500 restless and often resentful enemy prisoners. Nor did it help that the Americans' British captives had early on earned this stubbornly persistent reputation for misbehavior after feeding the fears and the animus of their local hosts. So it should come as no surprise that residents of Lancaster and outlying communities routinely complained to patriot officials of the dangers posed by their prisoners. Now, that said, there was also this business of provisioning and hiring out. A number of local merchants were actually enlisted to assist with the prisoners' provisioning to ensure that they were properly supplied. So there was some money to be made in the enterprise, and these few merchants stood to profit from the prisoners' presence. Meanwhile, some of their neighbors, farmers, artisans, shopkeepers, were keen to compensate for the wartime labor shortage by hiring the captives to work on their farms, in their workshops. And that was particularly the case with many of these German prisoners, who generally proved eager and reliable laborers. And so in Lancaster, there was this measure of ambivalence with regard to the prisoners. Not every member of the community was disappointed by the arrival of a new batch of prisoners, nor were they always happy to see them go. Now, that being said, for the better part of the hostilities, prevailing sentiment often oscillated between mild to severe anxiety. Now, for most of Lancaster's patriots, the majority of their captives constituted a nuisance at best, a source of peril at worst. And so for the most part, I'd say locals proved reluctant hosts.
I have to imagine that Lancaster's like a lot of other American towns. It may lean patriot, but that doesn't mean that every resident is a patriot. They might be a loyalist or even a fence sitter or neutral. How did Lancaster's loyalists or fence sitters react to having so many British POWs in town? Did their presence inspire the loyalists to riot, cause trouble, or act to assist the POWs in any way?
With regard to loyalists specifically, the prisoner's presence could prove either debilitating or empowering. Life in revolutionary Pennsylvania was a precarious business for both loyalists and neutrals who fared poorly at the hands of the state's patriots. Pennsylvania's revolutionaries operated from a pretty simple formula. You were either for or against them, and if you chose poorly, you and your family could pay a severe price. So loyalists were alternately harassed, assaulted, fined, even in cases imprisoned. So if you numbered among Pennsylvania's so-called disaffected, you needed to play a very careful hand. For Lancaster's loyalists, that of course meant that they associated with these prisoners at their peril, for that was considered potentially subversive behavior. It could invite the suspicions, the hostility of local officials, or even worse, the local militia. If you were a loyalist in Pennsylvania, and in Lancaster particularly, anonymity was your friend, so most opted to keep their heads down by avoiding overt associations with the prisoners. Now, that said, some local loyalists were sufficiently alienated from the revolution that they were willing to take some risks by defying their patriot neighbors and associating with the prisoners. These associations, they could assume a variety of forms. Some loyalists engaged in casual fraternization by boarding British officers in their homes. Others shared intelligence with the captives. Some loyalists were prepared to assume an even greater risk by helping the prisoners escape. Now, in at least one case, they sought to orchestrate a rebellion with the aim of liberating and arming the prisoners so that they could actually fight their way to British lines. And this, by the way, goes very badly for the prisoners. Now, others took a more subtle approach to facilitating escapes. By war's end, Pennsylvania boasted an elaborate escape network featuring loyalist guides and safe houses. So you'd find local loyalists actually escorting fugitive prisoners to the safety of British lines and taking refuge along the way in other loyalist homes. Now, revolutionary authorities took pains to unravel the network, but they were never entirely successful. But loyalists who were caught aiding those escapes faced grave consequences, and a few were actually executed in Pennsylvania for their troubles.
Before we move on to the time warp, I wonder if you would tell us whether it's true. Did the Continental Congress try to entice German soldiers to desert the British Army with promises of citizenship and land? And if so, if that's true, did the citizens of Lancaster play a role in this plan?
Yes, that was part and parcel of this broader Continental campaign, as a strategic campaign to undermine British military operations by promoting German desertions. Now, the thinking of Continental officials was that because these Hessians were, for all intents and purposes, hired guns, mercenaries, they weren't especially invested in the contest. Strictly speaking, it wasn't their fight. So Congress assumed that if they were given the proper incentives, they would desert in significant numbers. And this campaign is actually set in motion before the first Germans even arrived on American shores, during the summer of 1776, when Continental officials planned to entice the Hessians with these promises of civil and religious freedom and material opportunities. And in some ways, this made perfect sense. Most of these German troops, after all, hadn't experienced much freedom or opportunity in the old world, and ultimately it was the material opportunities that resonated most powerfully with the Hessians. The Hessians were amazed by the sheer abundance on display throughout the colonies. So as early as 1776, Congress promised every German enlisted man who quit British ranks and defected to the Americans 50 acres of land. Now, officers were promised even larger allotments of land. So a captain, for example, would receive 400 acres if he deserted. But contrary to American expectations, the Germans were very slow to respond. And so later in the war, Congress actually sweetened the deal, throwing in some livestock for enlisted deserters and offering even larger grants of land. Now, residents of Lancaster did actually contribute to Continental efforts by encouraging desertions among their German prisoners, but it's hard to know whether they were principally motivated by Continental imperatives or by more personal considerations. One of the principal catalysts for the German prisoners' desertion and ultimate assimilation was hiring out. Now, that more than anything else exposed them to the material opportunities available in the United States. Now, the hiring out of German prisoners was eventually promoted by Continental officials, but more often than not, local or personal interests drove the hiring of prisoners' labor, as residents of town like Lancaster sought to augment the local workforce by capitalizing on their captives' manpower. And that's really as cynical as it sounds. That said, over time, many locals did forge bonds with their prisoners, which in turn facilitated desertion. That's why years after the war, you could find significant numbers of these one-time captives residing near their former sites of detention. Indeed, it's been estimated that upwards of 5,000 German auxiliaries ultimately chose to remain in North America. It's true, of course, that desertion was common in 18th century armies. So, for example, a significant portion of German soldiers on campaign in Europe, say, could be expected to desert. But what you see happening with these German soldiers during the Revolutionary War, though, this is a sort of desertion with a difference. They're not deserting in Europe near their homes. They're deserting thousands of miles away from home during a foreign war in this alien environment, but it's also an environment rendered a little less alien by their interactions with German-American communities like Lancaster. And so, in other words, by war's end, this Continental campaign paid some significant dividends.
That's fascinating, Ken. But now we must move on to the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if Lancaster had not played host to over 3,000 British and German POWs? How would the POW's absence have affected the process by which the people of Lancaster created an American identity?
Oh, the dreaded counterfactual. Without those prisoners, thousands of them, bear in mind, I can only assume that the outcome for Lancaster would have been very different. For locals, the captives' presence created challenges and opportunities that simply would not have existed otherwise. So, over the course of a long war, I suspect that locals' patriotism would have ebbed much more than it would have flowed, which frankly was more the norm for communities not only in Pennsylvania, but all across the rebellious colonies. In short, I think Lancaster's particular wartime experience would have far more likely resembled that of other communities during the War for Independence. absent the clear and present dangers posed by those captives, conditions would have proved much less conducive to the nurturing of those broader ties that ultimately helped locals transcend, even if only temporarily, their particular attachments, their more particular attachments. Having said that, the war itself, on its own terms, surely would have made some difference for Lancaster. The colonial wars of the latter half of the 18th century had helped bring together portions of this very diverse community by encouraging residents to overcome some of their differences and cooperate in pursuit of shared interests, again, even if only temporarily. So, during the early mobilization for the Revolutionary War, the threat inherent in the conflict, along with its accompanying anxieties and resentments, would have, I think, helped to unite segments of the community and link them in invisible ways to the broader American resistance. But over time, as the threat receded or became less evident in locals' daily lives, I imagine support for the war and commitments to the cause would have been more likely to flag, perhaps even dramatically. And this is precisely why, by the way, Lancaster's prisoners made such a critical difference. For Lancaster, the prisoners were just absolutely game-changing. On some level, those prisoners brought the war to life in Lancaster and kept it dangerously close at hand. In some quarters of the community, Lancaster's British captives fed anxieties and resentments that lasted through the duration of the hostilities. Those prisoners proved absolutely instrumental in enabling local patriots to imagine themselves as a people distinct, a people apart from their old world enemies.
Before we conclude, would you tell us what you are researching and writing about now that you are free of your POW experience?
I'll never be entirely free of that POW experience. At the moment, I'm mulling over a few options. The first, and the less likely, involves a potential article featuring some surplus material related to the specific problem of prisoner retaliation that never made its way into the book. The material just simply wasn't a good fit, and I'd have had to force it in, which would have, to my mind, compromised the overall structure of the book. What I'm more likely to do, though, is revisit a project, a microhistory, actually, that I began researching some years ago in graduate school, involving an infamous husband murder in revolutionary Worcester County, Massachusetts. A loyalist woman successfully conspired to murder her patriot husband with the assistance of 3 accomplices, 2 British prisoners of war and a young Continental soldier who just happened to be carrying on an affair with a wife. The conspirators were ultimately tried and sentenced to hang, at which point the wife revealed that she was several months pregnant. Now, this news, of course, raised questions of paternity, adding to just an already fascinating case. That was just another wrinkle. I'm particularly interested in the ways in which the anxieties, the resentments, the pressures, the dislocations of war shape not only public perceptions of and reactions to the case, but also its outcome. I found that the case raises interesting questions about the workings of wartime justice and the gendering of loyalism. So that's where I'm likely headed.
And where is the best place to look for more information about you, Dangerous Guests, your new book, and how to get in contact with you?
Well, as you mentioned earlier, I'm currently an associate professor of history at Washington College in Chestertown, Maryland. You can find me on Washington College's website, on the history department page, or on the American Studies page. You can reach me directly via email at kmiller4@washcoll.edu. I have book pages at all of the usual sites, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or you can visit the publisher's page at Cornell University Press. You'll find additional information on Facebook. Just go to Dangerous Guests, which features the latest book-related news, including the dates and the locations of upcoming book talks and signings.
Well, Ken, this has been a fascinating conversation. You have really changed the way we view the American Revolution by putting the experiences of the POWs and the people of Lancaster, Pennsylvania so close together for us. I mean, we really now have a better view of how the people of the American Revolution, both enemies and patriots, lived through it. So thank you.
You're very welcome, Liz. It was nice to catch up. It's been a long time.
The presence of women and children, opportunities to hire out your labor and to acquire free land may not be how many of us pictured the War for Independence POW experience. But our conversation with Ken reminds us that there were many different types of POW experiences. Many American POWs experienced captivity in British prison ships, many of which were located in New York Harbor. Of course, Some Loyalists and British soldiers shared the prison ship experience, as Americans kept so-called prison hulks in the Hudson River off the shore from Poughkeepsie, New York. It also may not have occurred to us that civilians experienced POW life too. Our conversation with Ken revealed that the presence of over 3,000 British and German POWs caused the people of Lancaster to band together to protect their community and way of life, and in doing so, they developed and adopted an American identity. You can find more information about Ken, his book, Dangerous Guests, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page for this episode, benfranklinsworld.com/048. If you love history and free history books, don't forget to join Poor Richard's Club, the social community for Ben Franklin's World listeners on Facebook. You can join the conversation and get in on our free book giveaways by visiting benfranklinsworld.com and signing up for the Franklin Gazette. Or you can text BFWorld to 33444 and use the link in your confirmation email. And finally, have you seen Hamilton the musical yet? Let me know what you think or if you have plans to see it. You can send an email to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or leave a comment on the show notes page for this episode or in Poor Richard's Club. I had the opportunity to see Hamilton the musical last week, and it was awesome. I went with a group of early American historians, which always promises to be a good time, and we watched the show together. The music took a bit of getting used to because I'm not typically listening to hip hop or rap, but the lyrics were great, the acting was fantastic, and the history the show portrayed was accurate. I highly recommend seeing this play if you have the opportunity, and if you can't make it to New York City, don't worry, because there are 2 national touring companies that will be performing Hamilton in cities throughout the United States beginning in 2016, and Hamilton the musical will also be performed in London's West End starting in 2017.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.